This is Ask an Expat with Marcus and Matt from An Expat's Russia, where we answer your questions about what it's like to live, work, and travel in Russia.
Hi everyone, welcome to this video. Today we're going to explain why Americans know nothing about Russia. So there are three things that come to mind for me when talking to Americans about Russia. First, there's a real misunderstanding about media coverage of Russia. And in the West, it's very biased against Russia. And we'll get into that. The second thing is just the vast cultural differences. I think when we think about Russians, we see, people that pretty much look like us. But actually, Russians are probably about as far away from Americans culturally as you can get without being totally different, like, say, Arabic countries or Asian countries. And then the third thing is just general ignorance about Russia and Russian history. For example, I get asked on a very frequent basis, maybe not asked, but people infer that Russia is some completely unfree country that's a dictatorship and there's no free economy there and it's still communist in many ways. And this is so far from the truth. It blows my mind every time I have these conversations. And I get these conversations with people who are honestly quite educated in the US. So Marcus, you're in Europe right now, but I'd be interested, have you seen some of these things as well when talking to people about Russia? And maybe let's start with the media coverage of Russia.
Especially with my relatives here in Germany, sometimes, you're in, or just other Germans, you're in a conversation and I tell them that I lived in Russia for many years, and going back to ignorance, some of them made really just outrageous comments like, I heard there, especially when the ruble, crashed basically in just after 2014, we visited Germany, and their comments like, I heard there's not that much food in Russia, or, people are doing terribly. And I'm thinking, at the time I was thinking, Russia is just a 3-hour flight away from here. So yeah, it seemed odd to me that being so close to Russia, but the view of Russia was very, very different from the view of Russia in the US. I thought, how could it be that Russia is so close, but so far in that regard? So the media coverage, I don't watch a ton of media, but from what I gather, just in conversations, it's just like you said in the US, it's very biased, and it makes Russia seem like this, I wouldn't say third world, but, worse off place.
Right. Well, in many ways, there are parts of Russia that are not well off. I'm not going to sit here and say that everything is great and perfect in Russia, and, but what I really wanted to get at was just that media coverage. We talked about media coverage in a recent video, and I wanted to just kind of point out that in the United States, whenever Russia is brought up, it's always in a negative connotation. I literally cannot even remember a story where something good in Russia was discussed. It's honestly, it's very frustrating actually when Russia is such a big part of your life. My wife is Russian. I spent time in Russia. My career was, began in Russia. And so just today, I was on the phone with somebody and Russia came up, and, they just say something ignorant that they saw on the news. I was just driving in the car the other day, and there was talk radio on, and the guy was talking about how all of these troops are on the border with Ukraine and Russia, and there's going to be this big, massive civil war, and the United States needs to step in and do something. Otherwise, there's going to be, there's just not a clear coverage of Russia. And sometimes I think that the United States uses Russia as a sort of scapegoat. Like, if things are going wrong in the United States, it's like, well, let's just show how bad things are in Russia and get people riled up.
I saw a shirt the other day online, I think about like different Russian t-shirts, and it said "Blame the Russians." Yeah. I thought that was funny because that's the cliche that we are led to believe as non-Russians, right?
Right.
The Russian, in obviously in Hollywood, and it makes great film and stories and things like that. But the reality is, and doing visas a lot, I ask our customers after they come back from their trips, how was their trip? And it's overwhelmingly positive. And I tell them before they go on their trip, I say, you're going to be surprised.
Yeah.
Obviously, I mean, in a positive way. And they come back they go there with low expectations, or, you know, the expectations are mediocre. And then they come back, wow, it was wonderful. I want to go again.
Yeah. That's my overwhelming experience as well. I mean, how many tourists, I can understand why someone would not like living in Russia, right? Say you're an English teacher, you go to Russia, it just doesn't work for you, especially if you don't understand the language. I can understand why someone might have a bad experience in that case. But honestly, have you ever met tourists who didn't like their trip to Russia? I know this sounds crazy, but I really have not met somebody who's gone to Russia, seen Moscow or St. Petersburg, and said, oh, that was just not a great tourist destination. I've literally never heard that in 10 years. Yet, when you think about coming to the United States, just real quick, you always have this idea that, oh, you know, I'm going to go visit New York City. A lot of Russians have this idea. And then when they get to New York City, it's kind of like, it's not that great. It's kind of dirty. It smells real bad. People are not very nice. But the opposite, and you have these high expectations of a place like New York City. I think the same probably goes for Paris or London. But when people think about Moscow, they have very low expectations and they're always blown away.
They just don't know much about it.
Yeah.
I was going to move on to, another thing that why typically, you know, you mentioned like cultural differences. We talked about this in some videos, but one thing that, crossed my mind is, at least for me, when I was growing up in the US, I had this kind of subconscious belief, or I don't know, you know, people say America's a free country and America's the greatest country in the world. And, you know, America's fighting all these wars or, you know, going and basically, you know, showing the other countries how they need to live and and kind of subconsciously as you grow up, you look down, whether you want to or not, on different countries. You go there even as a tourist, you're thinking, oh, you know, this poor Latin American country, or this, you know, you're like, or you kind of go there thinking, I'll show them how we do it in America. Right. Like you're doing them a favor. Yeah. But when you see these countries, you know, especially if you live abroad, you're thinking, well, this country isn't so bad. And that's certainly true with Russia. You're thinking, well, at first you kind of hit with the culture shock where you're like, that's weird, that's strange. And you see these things that they do that they don't do in America, for example, or Europe. And you're like, oh, over time you're thinking, oh, this makes sense, you know, as you understand the culture and their context of why they do it that way.
Right. Well, I think what struck me the most in terms of cultural differences, when I went to Russia, I was interested in learning Russian. So obviously cultural differences are going to be a little less apparent because I was just personally interested in learning and trying to understand Russians and Russian culture. Let's say you don't, right? You go to Russia and, you know, maybe some things are quite surprising or frustrating. But when I came back to the United States after 5 years in Russia, that's when this was the most apparent. There's a thing called reverse culture shock. And sometimes you take for granted things that actually do work really, really well in Russia. And then you come back to the United States. One example that still blows my mind today is that in Russia, you can send anyone money for free without any commission from your, you know, debit card to their debit card using just their phone number.
Right.
In the United States, it's literally impossible. You have all these third-party systems and like you could just sign into your bank account, type someone's phone number in. It didn't matter where their bank account was, and send them money. No commission, nothing.
even sending, like putting money on somebody's phone or other bank account through those terminals everywhere. Like you could just put cash in there. I thought that was I was like, why don't we have this in the US? I mean, that's just kind of, you would never have that in the US, right?
Right.
It's just not gonna happen. But there are a lot of those little things that you think, oh, that's actually really, really convenient.
I mean, the biggest frustration when I came back was public transportation in the United States. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So, I was used to being able to go anywhere in Russia without a car. Came back to the US, I had a car, but when you live in a city in the US, even having a car is a huge burden. I would say even more so than Russia, because there's nowhere to park. And if there is a place to park, it's like $20 a day, $40 a day. I remember driving to a job interview in New York City, because there's no way to get there unless you take your own car. $48 to park for 2 hours.
Wow.
No other options. Unless you want to walk.
Well, I grew up in a small town. So, I grew up in a very small town, rural Oregon. When you go to Portland, I guess, you pay for parking. But I would come to Europe often, and I'm like, now I got to pay for parking. I went to Moscow. I lived there from 2012 to 2019. And it was just in 2016 that they started doing paid parking in downtown Moscow. Yeah. With a city of, 15 million. So I'm thinking, wow, it's, they're kind of coming late to the paid parking game. But then you can still find, not downtown Moscow, but you can still find, park near a metro station for free, like in kind of a residential area. Park for free, get on the metro and go a couple stations. Their paid parking, it's growing, but that's one thing that I thought was kind of interesting for such a big city. They didn't have it for so long.
Yeah. Well, so what I really wanted to touch on actually was how these cultural differences shape people's opinion of Russia. And one of the things that I noticed, living in Russia and being connected to Russia and following Russian news, was that even something as simple as the understanding of the words yes and no can make a huge difference in the way that Russia is portrayed, and the way that, people shape their opinion on Russia. For example, I noticed very quickly in Russia that Russians understand the word yes and no very, very differently than Americans. Maybe this may come as a surprise to our viewers who are not American, but when an American says yes, it typically means nothing more than maybe. And when a Russian says yes, it almost always is very clear that yes, I would only say yes if that's something I really want to do. So you get wishy-washiness from Russians when you say, hey, let's meet up tomorrow. And they're like, I don't know. If they're not sure, they won't tell you yes.
They're not going to say.
Whereas an American, no matter what you ask him, hey, do you want to go to to this event tomorrow? It's like, yeah, let's do it.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, everybody always agrees. Maybe.
Right.
And so,
that's an interesting point, because in the US, you agree to the idea, but it wouldn't actually, maybe tomorrow is not the best day.
It rarely ever happens, right?
Yeah, that's great. That's a good idea, kind of. And then you're like, well, I have something going on, but you kind of beat around the bush, right? Russians don't do that.
Right. And the other side of the coin is the word no. So when an American says no, it means unequivocally, no, I don't want to do whatever we're talking about. Whereas when a Russian says no, it's almost like an invitation to start negotiations, right? So if I ask you, hey, do you want to buy this for me? And you say no. As a Russian, and again, I'm kind of making a general stereotype here, but I think this holds true. The Russian would think, oh, well, I just haven't convinced him well enough yet. That's why he doesn't want to do it or buy it.
Because you stopped and answered.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Almost completely ignoring something is the only way to say no in Russian.
Yeah.
And so
that's true.
For me, I always thought, how does this, even a cultural difference this simple, how does that transfer itself into the way we view Russia? Well, think about how political parties are working. We have the president of the United States and the president of Russia, and they have, their foreign service specialists who are, working on relations between the countries. And neither of them speak each other's language, but I would honestly even say that the Russians speak English much better. I don't think there's anybody in the U.S. Foreign Service who speaks Russian, at least not publicly. And so how do you get these people to agree? They don't speak each other's language. They have these cultural differences on words as simple as yes and no. How are we going to, when Putin says, no, I'm not going to pull out of that nuclear arms treaty. Well, to Putin, he's understanding that as well. You know, they haven't convinced me well enough yet. You know, like I'm saying no right now. Whereas the Americans are like, he said no, he's not going to do it. And nobody understands what's going on. And it blows my mind that we're still at, you know, a situation like this in 2021 where, you know, political figures can't even overcome, you know, what I seem to see as basic cultural misunderstandings.
Right. And the misunderstandings can come from, you know, a deep historical kind of mindset or mentality where, you know, the people were conditioned that way. One example is that kind of blows my mind when I hear it, because in the US, you know, if there's a law, we look at the law as, you know, right and wrong.
Right.
And Russians, you know, typically they don't rely on their government too much. So
they're skeptical.
You know, when the law comes, they're skeptical of, you know, things that come out. So, for example, I hear this quite often. Russians will say, well, there's a Russian saying like something like, if you really want to, then you can do it. And I'm thinking, and they use it in cases where in the US, I would think, no, you can't. You still can't do it. Not even if you want to. So there's this kind of, you know, outlook that the government doesn't have my best interests. So, you know, if it says no in the law, you cannot do this. Well, you can if you don't get caught or if you really, really need to in your circumstances.
Right.
Whereas we wouldn't do that in the US.
Yeah, exactly. So I think these are kind of like the biggest cultural differences and sort of reason for confusion around Russia. Like I said a little while ago, really, if you go to Russia, you see an incredible place that almost seems unbelievable. At least that's kind of the feeling I had in the beginning. And it was just because we as Americans are conditioned that Russia is such a bad place and there are so many problems there and, you know, it's not developing correctly. Well, I mean, have we ever thought maybe it's just developing differently? It's doing its own thing.
Right.
So I think instead of judging Russia based upon, especially, you know, things that happened in history, and a lot of people in the US judge Russia based on what happened during the Soviet times. Nothing could be farther from reality, in my opinion. So I think looking at Russia,
I was going to say real quick, I tell our customers going to Russia as tourists or, you know, doing business, I say, don't go there thinking this is the only way to do something. Also, I say, you know, go with an open mind and you'll see that they do it not right or wrong, but differently. And people usually, you know, they'll come back thinking, oh yeah, it totally makes sense that, you know, they do it this way because of this situation and not because, you know, they're doing it wrong.
Right. So I hope that we gave some sort of unique insight into why typically Americans look at Russia from a very tinted sort of glass, so to speak. I think if you just look at Russia from an open mind, you will see something that's far more interesting than you can imagine. And everyone that I know, my best friends who've lived in Russia, really enjoyed their time there, enjoyed Russian people, learning about Russian culture. There's something different in every country of the world. And sometimes we just need to look at it a little bit differently to see those pluses and minuses. Let us know what you thought of the video in the comments below. And we'll see you in another video.